Good morning, guys, and welcome to the podcast. I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker today, Brian Seidensticker from Ohio, and he is CEO of Tax Sale Resources. And so, for the audience that is interested in tax lien investing, getting started, what it is, how does it work, risk and benefits. Brian's our man for today. He is sponsoring the show for this episode, and I'm really happy to have him on and talk about what he does with tax sale resources and how he can help people interested in tax lien investing. So, Brian, welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited.
Yeah, briefly, quick intro background, and I'm excited to dive into the Q&A.
Yeah, I guess a background. I jokingly tell folks I did not grow up with aspirations of being in the tax sale industry. I've only ever met one individual who was the child of a parent who happened to be in the industry, so was doing it since young. But I think most folks fall into this space. I was an aerospace engineer by training in I call it my previous life. I was in what sounded like a pretty cool dream job. I was working in the missile defense, working on rockets, doing some pretty cool things, and actually went on vacation for about 6 weeks and came back. And prior to coming back, I always felt like I was like running and running. What I didn't realize is I was apparently running on a hamster wheel, because I came back 6 weeks later. It was like I never left. Like all of this day-to-day stuff getting done, but I really didn't miss anything while I was out. And it was an epiphany for me. And that's what I can't say it was the first time I thought about, but definitely helped me make the decision of I got to find something else that scratches my passion in life of like actually accomplishing something on a daily basis. I like big, juicy problems. I like solving them. And that's what led me really initially into real estate investment, fix and flip, nothing really crazy proprietary on that front. This is 2007, 8. And then I got upside down a couple houses that we were doing in Montana, which is where I'm originally from. And the weird thing about how Montana tax liens work is every potential investor that might buy the tax lien on your house, you have to send a notice, a certified letter. So I got like 40, 50 certified letters in the mail from folks. And some language can be scary. You could lose your house over all this unpaid bill of $1,500. But to make a longer story shorter, even though I've already made it long enough, Chris, that basically opened my eyes to this whole world of tax lien investing, and shortly thereafter dove into the space.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Yeah, really interesting background and story. And for people that are listening to this, because you mentioned fix and flip and just single family landlord, what is tax lien investing and how does it work?
Yeah, there's lots of different angles and uses of tax lien investing. And I guess I've been in the space since 2007, 2008-ish. So scary, coming up on the 17 years or so, 17, 18 years. There's tax liens and there's tax deeds and there's a bunch of things in the middle. But as far as tax lien investing, I like to compare it to micro mortgage and note investing. That's the closest thing I could think, because what happens is if somebody doesn't pay their property taxes, is what we're talking about here, the county, in some states, not every state, it is governed state by state. The states have the option of putting a lien on the house, the property's, the owner's house, and then they can sell that lien to a third party, right? Because the county, or typically the county or where the jurisdiction is, they just want to balance their budget, right? They've got firemen to pay, policemen to pay, roads to pave, etc., schools to fund. So they just want those tax dollars in order to do their thing. And so they turn around and they sell that lien to third parties. And those are the investors in the space. And that lien comes with an interest rate similar to a mortgage. Typically, it's governed by the state statutes, but anywhere between, let's say, 5 and 20% ish is where liens land. And so the investor basically gets this piece of paper similar to mortgage that if the property owner doesn't redeem after a period of time, which can be years down the road, then that lien holder has the option to foreclose on that property. Again, just like a mortgage. Most 97, 98% of all liens redeem, meaning the property owner comes forward and pays their taxes. They pay the taxes that were due. They pay the penalty interest that was due to the county, but the county basically takes that penalty interest, turns around and pays that to the investor. And that's how investors in tax lien world make their money.
Mm-hmm. And so a follow-up question I have for you is, with this, if I look at the risk spectrum, the audience, usually they're doctors, lawyers, dentists, they're looking for very safe, predictable stable investments. They don't want kind of gyration, crypto or something, or they want very safe and predictable. So you look at the risk spectrum, you basically have like very volatile assets, then you got the market, then you have real estate, you have insurance products. Where does tax lien investing fall on this risk spectrum?
I think it's certainly not risk free. There's a lot of misinformation out there that is, quote unquote, guaranteed, and nothing is guaranteed. Taxes and death, as I've heard, is the quip that I get back of the two things that are guaranteed in life. But it's certainly, I'd say, low risk, right? And I always try to compare liens to mortgages, because typically in a mortgage, which is seen as a pretty safe investment, right? You're into that, property, let's say 70, 80% of what the value of that property is, with the same essential mechanism of if it doesn't pay, what you can do, the foreclosure process. Liens, on the other hand, you're typically into the property for less than 10% of the property. In most cases, less than 5%, whatever the tax amounts, maybe a couple of years of taxes, that's what you're into that property. And so the chances of that property value degrading enough to where you dip into that is not zero, but very low. And I guess where you can get caught, and this is where most people maybe make the wrong initial purchase, is, but if you buy a lien on what is a worthless piece of property to begin with, then you really own a piece of paper on nothing, right? You don't have much value there. And there's certainly parcels out there where tax liens are sold and that parcel has no value. I've seen examples of it's literally just a mailbox or it's a chunk of sidewalk. It's interesting how when the county carves up and the parcels, there's these weird shapes and things, and the county, right? It's not necessarily their fault, but they're not going to do all the research to tell you what's worth buying, what's not. So they just sell these liens. And so the people that don't know how to do their research and to find which ones are worth buying, which ones are not, right? It's really avoiding ones that are not is where you can get burned. But outside of that, in general, it's a very safe investment if done correctly.
Yeah. And I love this idea where you talk about being done correctly. And we'll transition into what tax sale resources is, what it does, how it helps investors or people interested in tax liens get into this area.
Yeah, and we've been talking about liens. The other end of it is the tax deeds, as we call it. Instead of buying a lien, you're buying a deed, right? And deed is basically you're buying the property at the auction. It's a unique deed that you get, depending on the state again. But I guess Tax Resources essentially is a provider of software and information that allows investors, both tax lien investors and tax deed investors, real estate investors, to filter through everything that was going on in the industry and filter down to the liens that are worth buying and which are not, right? Based on all the property data, looking at the parcel boundaries and all that stuff. And I guess to go back to my origination story, when I got in the space back in the late 2000s, there was no resource like that this existed. Just knowing when an auction was going to occur by states and the list of typically parcel numbers associated with that sale, there was no resource for that, right? And the website that is now Tax Resources just started as an internal database. Again, this is before OneDrive and Google Drive. There's way better ways to share this information. But at the time, I used what I knew how to do. I built a simple website purely because my sister, who was my number one and still best employee, kudos definitely to her. And I've got some great team members, but she's been here since day one. We just needed to share information back and forth. She was in Montana. I was in Arizona working my aerospace job still. And so I built this website, and it was really her whole goal was just calling counties to find out when these auctions occur and get the list of parcels. Something that simple, right? Now that's an easy thing to do. You go to taxresources.com, you can put in some information, and then in May, when there's 800,000 liens and deeds out there, you can narrow it down to the 50 that you want to buy, attend those 3 auctions associated with those liens. And that's all a very quick process, but it's a very massive work going on in the background to get it to that state that just no one was doing. And to my knowledge, no one else is still doing at the nationwide scale that we are today.
Yeah. And a follow-up question I have for you, because you mentioned tax liens and tax deeds, and especially because it's different county by county, state by state. What's the difference between tax lien and tax deed investing, and what are the best states for?
Yes, and that's a good question, because there's a lot of change going on in the space. It's interesting. Like, I think the idea of tax liens on properties has been around for a very long time. I don't know exactly the first year, but back in, I think, late 1800s. But really, the difference between tax liens and tax deeds is tax liens, you're buying an interest in the property, like a micro mortgage. You don't own the property. You just have a lien on the property, right? Tax deeds is you're actually buying the property, right? You will have intent in owning the real estate. There's actually several states that use kind of a combination of the two concepts that we call redeemable deeds. I don't think any of the states actually use the term redeemable deed, right? They use different terms, right? We just put a catch-all bucket, but it's the thought of, hey, you're going to the auction with the idea of buying the property. That's what you want, right? But there's a chance for the previous owner to redeem that property for a period of time. That's why I would call it redeemable deeds.
Yeah.
But it really just comes down to deeds and redeemable deed. Typically, those folks going to those auctions are real estate investors, right? They want to buy the property. And the folks that are buying the liens are looking for more of a passive, like note type structure. And every once in a while, people want to dabble in both. But usually, folks have a pretty set goal in mind, one or the other. And so it doesn't happen every day that people are just buying both of everything everywhere. Now, I guess the second part of your question of where are some of the best states, and I'm going to say best can be defined in many different ways, right? One man's trash is another man's treasure. There's certainly there's about 30 states right now that offer liens, and about the same amount of states that offer deeds. And so there's obviously some overlap there, right? Where some states, and there's more states adding a lien component, meaning the county would like to balance their budget as soon as that taxpayer is delinquent on their property taxes, right? So they sell the lien. But then there was recently a Supreme Court case called Tyler Hennepin. It was actually originated in Minnesota. And I guess I'll say had the pleasure, I don't know if it truly was a pleasure, but I've had the opportunity to head the committee that's monitoring the outfall from that with the National Taxing Association. And basically what the court case said was there needs to be a fair mechanism, right? If there's going to be a mechanism to essentially take over the property from the previous owner, there needs to be a mechanism to fairly compensate that previous owner. Again, I'm not a lawyer, right? And there's a whole lot more nuance to it, but that's what it said at the end of the day. States where there used to be, hey, go buy this lien, right? And then after so many years, you can just apply and get a deed, right? Basically, the Supreme Court and the interpretation of that is saying that isn't constitutional. And so states that never had a deed sale are now having deed sales as well as lien sales. So you can actually, Florida's had them forever, but states that have both type of auctions. And so you can, whether you want to just buy the lien or whether you want to buy the deed, you can basically pick the type of auction in that state you want to go to and plat accordingly. And then also there were some states that they chose not to sell the lien and just wait maybe 3 or 4 years, and they would basically foreclose on the property themselves and then sell the deed, and the county would keep what I call excess proceeds, right? They were due, let's say $40,000, right? But they sold it for $100,000. The county would keep that $60,000, and the Tyler Hennepin Supreme Court case basically said that's not constitutional. This should not be a profit generating mechanism, for the county. And so on the flip side, there were some counties that maybe, ignored selling a lien because they knew they would make more money at the end of the day, waiting and doing the process themselves, or maybe readjusting their thought process and saying, hey, maybe selling a lien to balance our budget sooner, knowing that they're not going to make a big windfall 3 years later, is not a bad idea either. And so you have more and more states basically going to this model of having both tax lien sales and tax deed sales. Sorry, Chris, long answer. It's a very complex, industry. It's one of those, as from an aerospace engineer standpoint, I never thought real estate could scratch that itch of learning something constantly every day, like all year long. And this space certainly does that.
Yeah. And what I really love is because it's a different type, it's note investing. It's like investing in mortgages, and it's a passive way of investing in real estate. The other question, I'm sitting back from the standpoint of the audience. And because when you talk about, I love this difference between tax liens and tax deeds. And my first question is because a lot of people back in 2008, pre-foreclosures, these were like big things. How does those investing in pre-foreclosures and foreclosures differ from tax deed investing? Is it the same thing? Is it different? Just for the audience.
Yeah, I'd say different, but similar, right? I think, the fallout from the financial crisis, right, the housing crisis, right, resulted in a gluttony of foreclosed on homes, right? And that resulted in, you find crazy deals at, pre-foreclosure auctions, buying notes at cents on the dollar. And then at the foreclosure, there's so many properties, people didn't have enough cash. And so you got great deals. But that inventory eventually dried up, and really by 2019, 2020, the amount of foreclosure properties out there, I guess take one step back. Because of that, there was a ton of people that you put that on top of HGTV with, fix and flip shows. There's probably 20 of them now everybody wanted to be a fix and flipper. And so the quantity of investors that jumped into that space was immense. But what happened is in 19-ish, by 19, is like the amount of inventory on the foreclosure, residential foreclosure side was not zero, but very small, minuscule compared to where it was in 2012, 13. And so that you have this, huge amount of investors and they're looking for something similar. And that's essentially what tax deed investing is, or tax lien, whether you're trying to do what I call front running, like trying to buy the property before the auction or the foreclosure ever occurs. Right now, there's people doing that in the tax lien and deed space before the auctions occur. Or you want to buy the property at the auctions, you can now do that with tax deeds, just like you would do it with a mortgage foreclosure auction. And so they're different, right? Different in the mechanism, but I guess the mentality and the approach is very similar, just a different set of opportunities, if you will, for a different reason.
Yeah. And then another question I have for you is investing in tax liens and tax deeds in terms of the counterparty. Are these people that fail to pay their property taxes or basically are, giving away their homes? Is it because of financial troubles? Is it because they're elderly and forgot to pay their property taxes? Or just talk about just this counterparty and how you can assess that if you are interested in this investing in liens or deeds.
Yeah, I think the mechanism of why somebody doesn't pay their property taxes, I think, varies. Is both of those reasons you mentioned certainly are there, I think, but the vast majority of liens, and what's interesting is I'm going to use Florida as an example. On the other end of the spectrum of, because of the bidding mechanism in Florida, it's called a bid down interest rate. So you start at 18% and you bid that down, and most liens, bid down to what's called a 0.25%, right? And that's the interest rate that is applying to that lien, right? That also translates to, I'm making it more complex with, there's a penalty, 5% penalty as well. But in today's world, if you're a savvy investor, right, and you can say, hey, I own this multi-million-dollar property, right, and I own $100,000 in taxes, right? You can basically take a 2-year loan at a 0.25%, right, by not paying your taxes. And where else can you get a $100,000 loan for 4%, right? So there's actually in Florida, I don't know exact percent, but there's a lot of them, right? And you can actually see in the data, like people that don't pay their taxes on time, like over and over and over, right? And that's why really delinquency wise, as far as people paying the property taxes on time, Florida's the worst. I think there's 750,000 tax liens. That's not dollars, that's quantity of tax liens sold in Florida each year. There's usually 1.5 million different property owners that are delinquent when the sale process starts, and equates to $600 million worth of tax liens sold in Florida. And so there's why people are delinquent is everywhere from on purpose to a hardship. And there are things like, for true hardship, actually the National Tax Lien Association has a foundation for the folks that are truly in a hardship can get their taxes paid, right? Not to confuse that with, I just want you to pay my taxes because I quit my job, right? That's not necessarily a hardship, but hey, I had a horrible accident and I had no control of the situation. I don't want to lose my house. That's where the NTLA Foundation steps in and pays those taxes. Again, sorry, Chris, a longer answer because it is always a little more complex.
Yeah. And like I said, this podcast is just to whet the audience's appetite and just talk about how tax sale resources can help. Another question I have for you is, let's say you use a software, you find the best states, how to safely invest in tax liens. One thing is, what are some tax lien investing mistakes, like kind of rookie mistakes? Just you talked about people just buying like a mailbox or these. What are some mistakes to avoid?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I mentioned some of those, right, as far as buying a lien on a worthless piece of property, right? That's not like very common, but happens. I think the other thing that people have this misconception is that, I have no downside risk in this investment. And I like to use Florida because it's by far the largest by volume and it's easy to get involved in. And so people typically jump in there. And so I'll point out some of the ways you can get burned in Florida. The other thing is, okay, in Florida, people historically have bought liens with, hey, they heard on the internet, I can go buy this lien, and then in 2 or 3 years, I can just apply and I'll get a deed. And that's not the case, right? You're going to, earn your interest, right? And so if you bid down to that 0.25% and you want to earn that 2 or 3 years later, you still have to go through what's called a tax deed application. There's still a separate sale. You don't get that deed unless you go to the tax deed sale and buy it. But then if you bid it down to a 0.25%, that's what you earned. And so this whole idea of, I thought I got 18. No, the bidding started at 18, you bid that down to a quarter, right? You can get burned there.
Yeah.
That same mistake a similar mistake can translate to just understanding the procedures, right? And I always recommend folks to speak to an attorney. I guess one thing that TSR is not, we're not an educator, we're not a coach, we're not really like holding people's hand how to do this. Our resources are excellent for folks that understand what they're doing. But if you're still learning, I always recommend talk to an attorney in the state that understands the space, right? That's not every real estate attorney. When you can ask some basic questions, and if they say, I got to get back to you on, it's probably not the right attorney to talk to. You're going to pay them to go educate themselves. There are attorneys that know what they're doing in the space already, and they can guide you to more of these things. And the other example I was going to use is use that same methodology, right? In Florida, if you start at 18, you bid down to 0.25%, there's what's called a penalty, which is an automatic 5%. So at least you're going to get that, right? 0.25% isn't a great return. 5% right now is not a good return, but it's better, right? People take that same mentality and go, oh, Arizona has a bid down. It's at 16, you bid it down, and people will bid that down to 0.25%. Arizona doesn't have that 5% penalty. So if you bid it down, that's what you're getting. And so you can say, hey, I just didn't do real well in Florida. I'll go to Arizona. Instead of bidding 0.25%, I'll bid it down to 2%, because you get an extra 1.75%. In reality, you shot yourself in the foot, because at least you were getting 5.25%, right? Now you're getting less than 3%, right? So it's just understanding the process, understanding the rules, understanding the legalities, right, behind owning that lien, and what you can and can't do is critical in order to be successful in the long run.
Yeah. And it's all about it's process. If you know what you're doing in equities, or if you know what you're doing, it's all, and there's always risk and downfalls and benefits to each step, and you have to carefully weigh those things. Then a follow-up question for the audience is, what percentage, let's say you're successful, you got the tax lien, what percentage of tax liens get paid off in full versus the holder of the tax lien has to go through a process to acquire the property if that tax lien is not paid off?
Yeah, and it's the short answer. On a nationwide scale, about 97, 98% of liens get paid, redeemed at some point in the process. It does vary by asset class. Vacant land is going to be a much lower percentage than single family homes, and then also by state, depending on the process. And so Georgia's process is you have to pay the full delinquent amount plus what they call the penalty on the bid amount. And so if you bid the property up to $100,000, or at the tax sale auction, the tax lien, or the property owner has to pay the 20% penalty on that. So they not only have to come with the delinquent taxes, they got to come with the extra 20,000. And so that's harder to achieve. And so there's just a lower percentage that redeem in Georgia versus Florida, where you're just coming with the taxes plus, in most cases, 0.25%. Right. So it varies, but in general, 98-ish% of liens redeem at some point in the process.
Yeah. I remember back in 2008, I was just curious about this space, and I went to a couple foreclosures, and it was really interesting. And there was here in Texas, they have I think it was I can't remember if it's tax lien or tax deed, but I went there, and it was just pandemonium. It was just people it's almost reminded me of a trading floor, just people just crazy. And then so for those people, is it possible to buy tax liens online, or you have to you have to find out when these sales are, and you have to go there, you have to have your money order ready, or is it their more efficient process?
There's one positive, if you want to consider positive, of COVID, is it forced many counties that probably would have never gone online with their sales. In order to get that money in, they had to have their sale online, because they were, hey, you have to stay 6 feet away, but I'm going to have an auction on the courthouse steps. There's probably 60 to 70% of all auctions that happen nationwide today are actually online, but there's a bunch of different providers. Again, TSR is not one of those. We're an investor-based software, not a seller-based software. But you can go through the process in Florida. I think every county but a couple has their tax lien sales online. So you can go register, you put a deposit in, bid, and all from the comfort of your couch if you want to. Now, being a data provider, I can tell you, right, that typically the better deals, right, the better rates are found at live auctions, right, because it's harder, right? Instead of having 1 million people bidding on that property, you have 50 people bidding on that property, or 2, right? And so there's in everything, right? There's pros and cons, right? If you can go to the live auctions, the chance of you getting a better deal are higher, right? If you just want ease of purchasing, there's certainly many opportunities out there to buy online from the comfort of your home.
Yeah, interesting. I really enjoyed this, and I think for the audience, it stimulated their curiosity. And if they wanted to find out more about tax sale resources, connect with you, learn more from you, how could they do that?
Yeah, pretty straightforward. Our website, taxsaleresources.com. Check it out. There is a phone number on there. And if you call the phone number, there's actually a real person on their end that will at least guide your question in the right direction if you want to connect. But just check out our website, taxsaleresources.com, and go from there.
Awesome. Great job. Thanks for coming on and keep up the great work.
I appreciate it, Chris. This was fun. Hope we can do it again sometime.